Started. Welcome to our Unit 5 Thursday live session, y'all. Good to see everybody who's wandering into our live session. We're going to start the way we always do with a little bit of logistics. This week's logistics is going to be a little bit different because I got some, or not this week's, this day's logistics is going to be a little bit different because I got a big old update. It's going to be different from what I told you on Tuesday. So, let me go into our course content folder and then go on down to this week, which is Unit 5 on defining knowledge. Of course, they don't work right now. Way to be, Blackboard. You're being slow as all get out. If I scroll down, you're going to see all the regular stuff. We're going to talk a lot about this article today in particular by Plato. We're going to look at the Theaetetus. Looking forward to that. That's today's class. It's all about defining knowledge. But now I want to talk about the graded assignments. On Tuesday, I told you we had 3 graded assignments this week, a DQ, a participation activity, and a reflection. I'm going to revise the amount of stuff that's due this week and say that we only have 2 things that are due this week. The only 2 required assignments for this week are the participation activity, and we're going to be going over part of this participation activity in class today. So hopefully you'll get a sense of what it is we have to do on this. It's a nice little worksheet. You have a nice way to sort of walk through it, make sense of it, should make sense. And then the other thing that's due is a reflection, a writing assignment based off of what we've been learning in the past week or so on external world skepticism and what we'll be learning in class today about defining knowledge. Both of these are going to be due on Monday. That's our usual due date. Yeah, good. I'm glad, Jesus, you were like, what the hell is this participation activity? Not to put words in your mouth, but you were staring at that participation activity and didn't know what to do. This will all make sense, this participation activity, once we discuss what we're learning in class today. So don't worry about that for now. But anyway, Monday deadlines. I grade the participation activity completely based off of whether you do it or don't do it. If you complete all of it, you get perfect credit. If you don't complete it at all, you get a 0. If you only do half of it, you get half credits, right? That's the way that works. This reflection, I grade in some sort of a similar way. So if you definitely answer all 3 of these questions and you fill out exactly how much I'm expecting you to write, your answer to number 1 should be about 1 sentence, maybe 2 sentences. Your answer to the second question should be about a paragraph, where you sort of defend yourself in a complete paragraph. And your answer to number 3 should be also a paragraph. So all told, that's like 1 sentence and 2 paragraphs. As long as you do that, you should get an A on this assignment. If you only answer 2 of the 3, 1 and 2, but not 3, you're going to get lower than an A. That's the only time you would get lower than an A. If you don't answer all the questions or you don't write a complete paragraph in response to this, something along the lines of that. I really value you just trying. That's what I want to emphasize for these assignments. You try, you get an A. That's the big idea on these. On the reflection, I give feedback. I'm going to let you know my thoughts on your particular response. On these participation activities, I usually check to see whether you did them and then give you full credit or not. And then what I often do, you'll see this pop up next week after the assignment's done, I will post an answer sheet to this conceptual analysis worksheet so you can see what the answers might look like. And Rashad says it's a complete paragraph for each question for the reflection. It's a complete paragraph for number 2 and number 3. It's only 1 sentence as an answer for the first question. So you don't have to be a complete sentence for the first one. That could be really short. Awesome. So those are the 2 graded things. Now, this was the thing that was graded that I mentioned that we were going to be doing last class, but I'm switching our discussion board this week to an optional extra credit. I know some of you have already posted in there, which is great. You are just going to already get some extra credit for posting in this discussion board. Congratulations. questions. Anybody who still wants to do this, you can do it, and it will count just as extra credit. Just like these discussion boards are usually worth 15 points, this is worth up to 15 points extra credit. And I'm going to dish out these extra credit points based on the typical discussion questions policy on grading. So if you want to get the full 15 points, you got to post 3 times. You got to post 1 post by Thursday, 2 replies by Monday. Make sure each of your 3 posts are on a separate day throughout this week. Make sure your response completely addresses the question in the prompt. Make sure your replies are quality replies, all of that stuff. That will get you up. That will get you the full 15 points of extra credit. If you fall short of that, that's fine. You'll just get, what, 9 points or 7 points or 12 points or whatever. I will just, quote unquote, grade these extra credits like I grade these, like I would grade it as a discussion post. But you do not have to do this. This is completely optional. This is not required. So this is just something you can do if you want for extra credit. And I want to tell you a little bit of behind the scenes for why it is I'm doing this. Right after our live session on Tuesday, I went to a meeting with some other faculty members on campus, and somebody who's sort of in a sort of main office at Kane gave us some information that said that a lot of us had a misunderstanding of what was required for us for these remote classes. A lot of us had to make these remote classes over the summer, and we had to follow a pretty strict guideline for how to make these classes. And part of the guidelines many of us thought, many of us seemed, I think we were actually tests, were that each unit requires a discussion post. And so what I did in my class, and what it sounds like many teachers did in their classes, is put a discussion post in every single one of their units, in addition to the other graded stuff. There are other typical assignments, like writing assignments or tests or the like. On Tuesday, many of us found out that we do not have to have a discussion post in every single unit. We're at the discretion to use it or not use it. So in our upcoming units, I might be getting rid of some of these discussion post questions. I might be turning them into extra credits as opposed to required things. I might still keep some of the discussion posts in some of these future units. So I'm going to be changing this as it happens. Hopefully between now and Tuesday, I'll have changed everything. So you'll see before this. But yeah, as Elmer points out in the chat, Elmer wrote, "No wonder it felt a lot for all his classes." This is a thing where I want to just say, like, good job on many of you for raising the concerns you have had in the first 4 weeks of the semester, as far as how much work you felt these classes are. Many of you have justifiably brought it to our attention that you've had a lot of work. You've had more work than usual this semester, and it's because of these requirements that we thought we had to do that it sounds like we do not have to do. We're allowed to switch out of these. So they might be happening in many of your classes where some of your other teachers start shifting around how many assignments you have to do each week. And I just want to thank you. I want to point out that, like, your voice has been heard, and you speaking up has worked. You've been able to raise an important issue, and at least some of us are trying to address it by trying to change how many graded assignments we give out in any given week. So thank you for speaking up. Sorry for the misinformation or our misunderstanding from earlier. And in general, I'm going to try to keep it so that there are fewer assignments than we've originally sort of planned out at the beginning of this semester. So awesome. All right, so that's all a little just update, little housekeeping for what's happening in this class. You got your 2 actually required assignments. Both of those are due Monday. The participation activity and the reflection are due Monday. And then this discussion board is now final extra credit. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. You can do it if you do want to. It's up to you. Any questions, thoughts, or concerns, feel free to write them in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I think it's time to get started on our big topic of the day, which is defining knowledge. And you know I got a PowerPoint slide on that, so I'm switching over to that PowerPoint slide as we speak. All right, so let's think a little bit about where we're at in this particular class, now that we're in the second half of Unit 5. We've been talking about studying knowledge for the past 2 weeks or so. So the study of knowledge goes by the fancy name of epistemology. Epistemology, which comes from the word epistem in Greek for knowledge, and ology in Greek is the study of something. And so far, mainly we've been tackling this question. Do we know anything? This is the challenge of skepticism. Maybe we're dreaming and all the stuff we think we know around us is not correct. That was all last section. Today, we're going to be starting to learn about an even more foundational question. What is knowledge in the first place? What we're going to be doing is analyzing the concept of knowledge, trying to figure out exactly what it means to know something. And we're going to be thinking about this in terms of conceptual analysis. We're going to try to figure out the necessary conditions for knowledge and the sufficient conditions for knowledge. We're going to really geek out over conceptual analysis. And then toward the end of this section, we're going to be talking about the importance or value of knowledge, why knowledge itself even matters. So that's our big topic today. And I want to start our live session by just asking this foundational, easy question. What are some basic claims you think we know? Don't act like a skeptic now. Don't worry at the super high stuff. If somebody says, like, what are some examples of stuff you think you know? What are some things you think you know right now? Just go ahead and start listing them in the chat. Some things that seem obvious, that seem to count as knowledge. Rashad says that he needs oxygen to survive. Nicole says that she bleeds. These are good examples of things that I bet all of us know. I've certainly seen myself bleed, unfortunately. It certainly seems like I need oxygen. I think I know that. What are some other examples? I'll wait. Elmer says, I need food. Good example. You need food to survive. Jam says, I'm in a class right now. That's a good example. Absolutely. Kervin says, oh, Elmer and Kervin just sort of jinxed each other. Kervin says, you can't live without food. Really nice examples. These all seem like foundational knowledge, right? And so the sorts of claims I put on here on this slide, water is H2O, I own shoes, Donald Trump is president, 3 plus 12 is 15, the sun will rise tomorrow, Edgar Allan Poe was a poet, 7-Eleven sells Skittles. One thing we could think about when we're asking the question, what is knowledge? We might try to think about what all these sorts of claims that we all claim to know have in common. Oh, nice. Jenny's currently in first grade music class with her sister. Very nice. Jam, yeah, it isn't negative 3 plus 12. That's just a dash. But yes, thank you for catching that. It should be positive 3 plus 12. A way of trying to think about this is what distinguishes these claims that we know from other sorts of claims that we might say we don't know. Right? The opposite of knowledge might be ignorant. And think about all the claims you might be ignorant of. Where you're like, I don't know that claim. I'm not sure. I wouldn't say that I know that. What might be the difference between knowledge and ignorance? So philosophers tend to use a technique called conceptual analysis in order to do this. Oh, and I made a mistake on this slide, so I'm gonna change something out real quick. Oh boy. The actual example I want to use is that Adele is 32, not that she's 31. So hopefully I just changed it. Yeah, good. So let's take this boring old knowledge claim. Stacy knows that Adele is 32. Adele, by the way, we're talking about is the famous singer, the singer who sang the song Hello. She sang the song Rolling in the Deep. She sang the theme theme to Skyfall, that James Bond movie. That's the Adele we're talking about. When somebody says Stacy knows that Adele is 32, philosophers like to analyze it down into variables. They like to talk about S knowing that P, where S stands for a subject or a particular person, and P stands for a proposition, some sort of statement, a declarative sentence that can be true or false. All right, so in this particular case, when we say Stacy knows Adele's 32, what has Stacy accomplished? What must be the case in order for her to know this? I'm going to try to describe a few common conditions that people say are required for knowledge. People refer to these as necessary conditions. The word necessary means needed. It's a must. It's an absolute requirement. These are things that people think absolutely have to be in order for knowledge to obtain. The first one is truth. The proposition we're talking about that somebody's claiming to know has to be a true proposition, not a false statement. And so that means in this particular case, Adele, the singer, must actually be 32 years old. Did anybody look it up to try to verify, is Adele actually 32 years old? Feel free to tell me in the chat. If you haven't done so yet, feel free to look it up. So when we talk about truth in this sort of case, we're saying this statement corresponds to reality. Thanks for verifying that, Nicole. She is. We're saying that statement accurately represents the world and the way the world really is. So a statement like Adele is 32 says there's some particular entity out there named Adele, right? That famous singer that actually has the property of being 32 years old, of being alive on this earth as that earth rotated the sun 32 separate times. And that statement is true if and only if there is someone named Adele that actually had that happen to her. Nice. So excellent. The opposite of true in this case is false. A statement's false when it doesn't correspond to reality. This would be a statement that misrepresents the world, says something inaccurate or untrue about the world. So when somebody goes around saying the earth is flat, they're making a false statement because while there is a thing we call Earth, the planet we're living on right now, it does not have the property of being flat. It's not a flat-shaped object. Instead, it's a round globe-shaped object. It's spherical, right? So that's a mistake to say the Earth is flat. That means the sentence, the Earth is flat, is false. That's a false proposition. And notice in this particular case, we're saying, sorry, I'm trying to go to a slide that's not here yet, sorry. We're saying in this case that this is false, even if people out there think it's true, right? They think it's true, but they're mistaken in this sort of circumstance. Maybe you've actually met people who are flat earthers. They believe that the earth is flat. There's a whole society called the Flat Earth Society, right? Those members might think the earth is flat, but the world is out there saying they're wrong. Not the world is in a bunch of other people, but the actual planet and its shape is what shows that their statement corresponds to reality. So in the chat, Jam asks, can we say for knowledge to be true, it has to be a fact, scientifically proven, and non-debatable? I would say the idea of truth is something we've talked about a lot here, but the main way we're thinking about it now is that it's just a relationship, going back to this definition here, a relationship between a statement and the actual reality that's out there. It's this thing that's not about whether it's even proven yet, not about whether we have scientific evidence for it one way or other. It's about whether the statement's correct or incorrect, whether it accurately corresponds to reality or misrepresents reality. That's the key difference. So this seems to be a key condition for knowledge. One thing you might ask to test this condition, to ask whether this really is a necessary requirement for knowledge is to ask the question, can we know false stuff? Are there claims out there that are genuinely false that we could still nonetheless know? And so let's take this as an example. I know that George Eliot is a man. Imagine somebody comes up to you and says, I know that. I know George Eliot is a man. I don't know how many of you know who the famous George Eliot is, but George Eliot is the author of a big old book that some of you may have had to read at some point of your life called Middlemarch. Maybe you were assigned to read it in high school, or you took a literature class here at Kane or somewhere else and had to read Middlemarch. But it's one of those like great works of literature that people talk about. And George Eliot is the author of Middlemarch. So do you think somebody could go around knowing that? Good afternoon. So the trick about this, for those of you who might not know this fun fact, is that George Eliot is not, in fact, a man. It is false to say that George Eliot is a man. George Eliot was a woman who was writing at a time in European history when the publishing industry was so sexist that women weren't allowed to publish books. So what George Eliot did as a result of this is publish her writing under a masculine name. She wrote this under a pseudonym, a fake name. And the fake name she became famous for was George Eliot. So here's an example of, imagine somebody coming to you and saying, I know George Eliot's a man. The way we might actually respond to that person is to say, no, you think you know that, but actually that sentence is false. So you don't really know George Eliot is a man. You can't know that. George Eliot is a man. So you've gotten that wrong. So that's a particular sort of case. Truth is about actual reality, not our perception of reality. That's the key idea of truth. Truth is a sort of thing that is a standard about what's actually correct or incorrect. And our perception of reality, we can get correct sometimes, or we can get wrong. We can fail to understand reality. Our perception could be off or incorrect. So in this particular case, we're talking about a mind-independent condition of knowledge. Truth is about reality, not about what's going on inside of our mind. Truth is something that is universally objective and out there in the world, not just in our mind. So I'm going to set up a poll right now to ask you the following question. Can we know false things? Take a particular sort of false sentence. I don't know, here's a false sentence. The New York Giants have won a football game this season. Can you know that? Can you say that you know that? By the way, the New York Giants have not won a football game this season. So that is a false claim. Could you know a false claim like that? Yeah, I'm attacking your team, Kervin. I could have chosen my team as well, the Eagles. They also have yet to win a game, but I decided to pick on you Giants. Sorry, y'all. So, all right, go Jam. Fly, Eagles, fly. I love it. We don't have much to fly about this year. Steelers are off limits too? Okay. All right, good to know. I won't make fun of anybody in the steel curtain. So, Kervin, you say you don't want to vote because how can you know something that's false? Then it sounds like you're saying in this case, you would answer no in that circumstance, right? You would say you don't know it when it's false. So it sounds like your answer would be no, we can't know a false claim, right? Am I wrong about that? I'm not sure. Did I call I called Rashad Jam by mistake instead of calling Rashid Jam? Did I make? Oh yeah, it's Rashad. Sorry, I misread our Eagles fan in here. Sorry about that. Oof, I'm just catching up in the chat. I'm just hoping that Jam's an Eagles fan too. I'm looking for any Eagles fans we can get in here. All right, so a bunch of y'all have voted, and interestingly, a bunch of you think we can know false things. I want to hear you all tell me why. To point out, by the way, I've just posted the results so you can see the poll right now. 15 of you said we can know false claims. 12 of you say we can't know false claims. So I want to hear what you all think now, because most philosophers are going to answer no to this question. Most philosophers are going to say, no, you need your statement to be true in order to know it. So tell me why you're going with yes for those of you who voted. Why do you think we can know false claims? Walk me through your thinking on this. Either post in the chat or hit that raise hand button. Let me know what you're thinking here. All right, I'm going to call on Rashad first, and then we'll get to Daniel's comment. Rashad?
Okay, so my idea of knowing a false claim is like when you know a false claim, I'm assuming that when you say a claim that's false, 90% of the time it's like you're thinking it's true. So if I say like a fake news, like someone's like fake news, like you look at fake news and you believe it's real. So it's like I read this article about this homosexual couple that had like actual birth because like actual baby birth because they had some ovary to rectal transplant thingy, and I read that and I thought it was true, but it turns out that was fake. So it's like, you know, you read a false claim, it's basically you don't, at least I'm assuming you don't think it is false. You're thinking that it is true. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I'm really glad you're bringing this up as an example. And this gets us, for what it's worth, to the next condition. So the next condition is going to be belief, right? And I think what you're doing in your example, Rashad, here is confusing believing something's true with a claim actually being true, right? So because the story you just said is you read some article and you believed that the claims in the article was true, but in fact, actually, in reality, the claims in the article were false. So here's what I would say about what you just gave as an example. While you thought you knew those claims, in fact, you were wrong, so you didn't really know them after all. What does everybody think about how I just described Rashad's circumstance? Rashad believed that he knew, but he was in fact mistaken, so that means he didn't know all along, right? Think about that way of thinking through this. And by the way, Jam in the chat writes, isn't reality subjective? The whole idea about truth in this conversation here is that truth is supposed to be objective, right? Here's our definition of truth. There should be an objective reality. Whether we have accurate access to that or not is separate, but there is an accurate reality, and truth is corresponding to that reality. The whole idea, going back now to the second condition, belief, is that belief is the subjective component to knowledge. I might believe things subjectively, but my belief may or may not match reality. Truth is matching reality. Belief is what I happen to believe, whether it's true or false. So this is a good way of thinking about this distinction, and I'm glad you brought that up. We've got some other examples in here. So Dan in the chat wrote, I feel like scientifically things get proven and disproven such that long-held quote-unquote facts are now false. And I agree with what you're saying, Dan. So here's the sort of thing that I would say. If you go back to, I don't know, pre-Copernican times, let's say 700 years ago, and you ask the leading sort of scholars of their day, does the sun revolve around the earth, or does the earth revolve around the sun? All the leading scholars of their time, 700 years ago, would say that the sun revolves around the earth, right? And they would all claim that as knowledge. They would claim that that's a fact, and that's a simple, obvious fact, right? And now we know that that claim is false. We understand at this particular point that everything they thought was a fact and thought was knowledge was in fact mistaken. So here's the way that I would say, I would describe what's going on. 700 years ago, everyone thought they knew that the sun went around the earth, but they were mistaken, so none of them actually knew that. And by the way, this is where things get a little bit scary. Going back now today, there might be all sorts of things that all of us accept as facts right now, as quote unquote scientifically proven, that might wind up being overturned 100 years from now. Better science might come along to uproot our understanding of everything. So this is part of the worry of skepticism, right? Maybe all the things we think are true aren't actually true. But at least you understand the standard of truth in all of this. This idea of truth is supposed to be this objective, not about what I'm thinking, not about even what everybody's thinking is correct, but actually objective correctness. So Greg brings up an interesting example of colorblind people in the chat. He says certain things are one color, but in reality, but to them it's gray. Yeah, and so color is itself a really interesting proposition or an interesting property. Color has this weird mix of subjectivity and objectivity to it. So there's a whole rabbit hole you could go down in that's just about the philosophy of color, and particularly the perception of color and what type of thing in the world color is, that I don't want to get into. But Greg, you've brought up a really interesting sort of weird case of reality versus subjectivity going on there. Kerbin's also brought up the Mandela effect a few times in here. I don't know if we want to dive into that a little bit too much, but feel free to Google Mandela effect on your own if you want to go down one of the weirder internet rabbit holes that's been out there in recent history. All right, so let's talk about the second condition of knowledge right now, just for the sake of time. The idea that not only does the statement Adele's 32 have to be true, but also Stacy has to believe that the proposition is true. That's this belief requirement. Stacy must actually think Adele is 32. So here's what we mean by belief. This is a little bit easier. Person believes a claim when she thinks the claim is true. She accepts it. She agrees with it. And this is a mental state about how somebody views the world. So there are all other sorts of mental states you could have. You could desire or fear or worry or hope or imagine or wonder whether. All of these are types of psychological states. Belief is the sort of most, I don't know, bedrock ones that you say, not only am I thinking about this claim, I am endorsing it. I am agreeing with it. I believe that claim is correct. So belief is about our perception of reality. There is a component of knowledge that's about our perception. And it's not about how reality actually is. The truth condition is about how reality actually is. So it's an important thing to just pull apart belief and truth in this term. So this is the moment where we can say we can believe stuff's true when in fact it isn't. As Nick says in the chat, we're very impressionable, right? We can sometimes get it wrong. Our perceptions can sometimes be mistaken. And there are a couple different ways you can go about not believing a particular claim. So one way is to believe the opposite, to say, not only do I not believe that claim, I believe that claim is false. I don't think Adele's 32. I think she's some other age, but not 32 years old. That's why some people could not believe the claim Adele is 32. Another way you could not believe is to just not have an opinion whatsoever about whether the claim's true or false. To just shrug and say, I don't know. Is Adele 32? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe she is. Maybe she isn't. I can't figure it out. In either case, according to what we're saying right now, if you didn't believe Adele's 32, you couldn't know she's 32. You couldn't go around saying, Adele's 34, I believe Adele's 34, I think Adele's 34, and somehow still know that Adele's 32. You couldn't have a guess one way or the other and say, I don't know whether Adele's 32. You couldn't lack an opinion about Adele's age, still know that she's 32. If somebody asked you, how old is Adele? And you say, what? I have no opinion. You couldn't then say, oh yeah, but I do know how old she is. I just have no opinion on what her age is. That doesn't make sense. So this seems to be the second condition. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff for now. These seem to be two conditions that lots of philosophers think are required for knowledge. And this is what we could consider necessary conditions. Absolutely required, we have to have them. A follow-up question for this, oh yeah, this is the reality condition and the psychological condition, right? Truth is about reality, beliefs is about what's going on inside your mind and your own personal psychology. Is there any more to knowledge? What are these actually sufficient conditions? Might be a question that you ask at this particular point. And this is the exact question that Plato was thinking about in our reading for class this week. And what we had to read for class this week, Plato was talking, well, it wasn't Plato himself. Plato always writes in the form of a dialogue. Let me just switch over to show you what that looks like, just so we remind ourselves. Where is this? Here. Plato is a famous ancient Greek philosopher, and he wrote a bunch of books. They're actually just dialogues. He wrote them as if they were conversations between two people. All of these people really existed in ancient Greece. So we had to read something called the Theaetetus. That's a real Greek person who lived in Athens 2,000 years ago. And he's talking back and forth between Socrates. Socrates is another famous ancient Greek philosopher. And Socrates was a real person that Plato knew. And Socrates was sort of like, I don't know, Plato's mentor. Socrates had this big following in Athens because he would just wander the streets of Athens and get into these big, heady, trippy philosophical conversations with people. So Socrates would just wander up to some dude like Theaetetus and say like, so what is one to say that knowledge is? Or Socrates would go to somebody named Euthyphro and go, so what do you think piety is? What is justice? All right, he would just wander the streets of Athens. And a bunch of like young people wound up flocking to Socrates and getting really excited by this. Socrates himself thought it was a bad idea to write down any philosophy. He thought the only way philosophy was in conversation. That's why he was always talking to people about these philosophical ideas. Fortunately for us, Plato didn't agree with Socrates about the whole writing stuff down bit, because Plato wrote a lot of his own philosophy down. And he tried to write down a lot of these conversations that Socrates actually had with real people. He probably didn't write them down verbatim, like word for word matching what actually the conversations were. But there seems to be evidence that Plato got the gist of a lot of Socrates' ideas down and a lot of his conversationalists' ideas down in these written dialogues. And for what it's worth, you could call Socrates lazy. Maybe he was, Jam. I'm not sure. But he did explicitly explain why he thought it was a bad idea to write this stuff down. We don't have to get into that for now. But here is what Theaetetus gives as a definition of knowledge. It's the exact definition we're considering right now. Theaetetus says, true belief is knowledge. Surely there can at least be no mistake in believing a claim that is true. That seems to be his definition of knowledge. Having a belief in a claim that is in fact actually true. All right, so Plato and Socrates disagree with this definition of knowledge. What Plato and Socrates wind up doing in this reading is criticizing this, mainly by saying those conditions, while necessary for knowledge, are not sufficient. Sufficient's a word that means enough, enough to guarantee. And so when you say, are the truth and belief conditions sufficient for knowledge, you're asking whether it's enough to know a belief, it's enough to believe a claim that is true in order to know that claim. Or maybe there's more to knowledge. So what we're doing right now when we're asking these questions about what's necessary, when we're asking these questions about what's sufficient for knowledge, we're essentially doing what's called conceptual analysis. What we're doing is analyzing a concept. We're breaking down a particular idea, a particular word, a particular concept like knowledge, or we could do another word like justice, or we could do another word like faith. And we break it down into a list of the necessary and sufficient conditions, the conditions we absolutely need in order for that concept to apply, and the conditions that are enough to guarantee that that concept applies, that all must hold in order for that concept to apply. This is essentially what defining a word looks like. So let's do this right now for a real basic example. I want us to do some conceptual analysis for a basic mathematical term that most of you are familiar with, and that term is square. X is a square if and only if. What? I want us to start listing some of the conditions that are necessary, that have to be true in order for us to say we know stuff. So let's fill this out together. What is one condition of a square? What does a square have to have going for it? All right, Jesus has got it. X is a square if and only if X has 4 sides. All right, that's definitely one condition. That's necessary, but that on its own isn't sufficient because, like, I don't know, parallelograms have 4 sides. Trapezoids have 4 sides. Rectangles have 4 sides, and none of those are squares, right? So what are some other things? So Curvin says the sides have to be equal. The sides of X are all the same length. So that's definitely another part, right? These are 2 necessary conditions for a square. 4 sides, the length of the sides are all the same. But again, parallelograms might fit this, and it might not be a square. So some of you said 4 corners. Somebody in particular, Elmer said, and Rashad said, we've got a 90-degree angle for our corners, I guess. The interior angles of X are all 90 degrees, right? They're all those right angles that form exact perpendicular lines to each other. Awesome. And another person, Nicole, mentioned the fact that it's a closed shape. So X is a polygon, is the fancy word for this, which is a closed shape. I guess we could also say that it's 2-dimensional. That's what a polygon is. So I think at this point, we've hit all the things you need to count as a square, right? All of these combined are sufficient. Each of these conditions is necessary. Of these 4 conditions are necessary for an object to be a square. And then all 4 of these conditions combined are sufficient to guarantee an object is a square. That's the idea of listing the necessary conditions and the sufficient conditions. And that's why in our definition up above, we've got this idea of if and only if right here. So on the if side of things, X is a square if each of these necessary conditions holds. So that's, I'll make this not blue anymore. That's the necessary bits. And X is a square only if all of these conditions hold. That's the only time it's going to be a square. that's when we've got, in this case, our sufficiency going on. So that's a conceptual analysis of a term. In mathematics, conceptual analysis is straightforward in this sort of way. But let me ask you a question right now. In the real world, actual concepts that are out there might be a little bit trickier, might be a little bit harder to work through. So let me ask you this question that has broken the internet in the past. Do y'all think a hot dog is a sandwich? What do y'all think? Is a hot dog a sandwich? I'm going to set up another poll right now. And I want you all to vote, although I see a bunch of you already voting in the chat. Go ahead and start voting in the poll itself. What do y'all think? Is a hot dog a sandwich? We got some no's, we got some yeps. We're like half and half almost. Rashad says it's not two pieces of bread. Sabrina says she feels like it has its own category. Zaria says it's two pieces. Rashad says, trust me, I was in the comments when this went viral. You were all over the place on this one. Interesting. So one thing we could ask to try to get at this is, what do we mean when we say sandwich? What is a decent definition of sandwich? And let's try to actually analyze the term sandwich right now. What is a sandwich? Rather than say X is a square, what do we say X is a sandwich, if and only if? What are our definitions of sandwich? Talk to me, y'all. See if I can move this to the left a little. All right, so it looks like you're saying items between two pieces of bread. Elmer's talking about two pieces of bread as well. I like the idea of items. Two pieces of bread with ingredients. All right, two buns and anything in between. All right, so we'll say items or something in between two pieces of bread. These seem to be the four conditions we're dealing with. It's got to be something in between two pieces of bread. I guess we'll have to fill this out. X is a sandwich if and only if X is something in between two pieces of bread. Do we buy each of these? Does that seem like a decent definition? Well, here's the fun of these definitions. By the way, most of you think that the hot dog's not a sandwich. 13 of you voted no. 7 of you voted a hot dog is a sandwich. So it's like a 2-to-1 ratio, just to check that poll out real quick. I think we can come up with counterexamples to each and every one of these particular conditions. So I'm just going to take them one at a time right now. Let's take this particular condition right here. I think this is too vague. Something? Like, could I put anything in between two pieces of bread and count it as a sandwich? Could I put a light bulb in between two pieces of bread and call it a sandwich? Could I put a building in between two pieces of bread and call it a sandwich? Jesus is into the idea of a light bulb sandwich. Dan says yes. Hyelmi says yes. Elmer says sure if you're hungry. Like Nick says an idiot sandwich. Could I put an idiot in between two pieces of bread? How about this? Could I put the universe in between two pieces of bread? Call it a universe sandwich? So what if we at least restrict it to something that you can eat, something edible? So I've revised this a little bit. But like, could I make a sandwich that's just peas in the middle? What if I just put soup in between two pieces of bread? If I made a soup sandwich? So I have concerns, basically. My short answer to this is I've got concerns about this first one. All right, how about this in-between criterion y'all are talking about? Let me change colors on you a little bit. Here's a criticism I got for this one. Have any of you heard of an open-faced sandwich? An open-faced sandwich is not stuff in between bread. It's stuff on top of bread. Have any of you seen this? I'm going to show it to y'all right now in case you haven't seen an open-faced sandwich. Let's go back to Google. Open-faced sandwich time. Here's what an open-faced sandwich looks like. You see all of these? Where all the stuff's on top of the bread? Open-faced sandwiches, they're real, right? They exist. So you don't got to have stuff between stuff, right? Rashad says he eats those for breakfast, right? And Kat says an open-faced sandwich is toast. What, so if you toast your bread for a sandwich, it's no longer a sandwich? Rashad did that when he wanted to cut weight. Interesting. Jesus is saying it's not a sandwich. That's so interesting. Wow. Look at this weird back and forth we got going on this one. Interesting, y'all. Toast is a sandwich, toast is toast. Oh, boy. This is the hottest we have been in this class. This is the most comments I've seen. Let me go back to our Word document right now. I'm going to catch up on the chat here. But like Jam, the word open-faced sandwich has the word sandwich in it. I'm not making stuff up, right? It's called a sandwich, right? So you could think of an open-faced sandwich as a subset of sandwiches, one type of sandwich, right? Am I wrong about that? All right, so here, let's go a little bit more. Let's talk about this two pieces bit right here. See what we like or don't like about this one. I'll go green for two pieces. So we already got open-faced sandwich as a concern for this, right? Because you only got one piece for an open-faced sandwich, right? So that's something you got going on there, right? You're only dealing with one. There are other sorts of criticisms you can have for single pieces. What about a wrap? Is a wrap a sandwich? Because a wrap is just one piece of bread wrapped around. Is a wrap a sandwich? Rashad's saying a wrap's not a sandwich, it's a wrap. All right, all of y'all are disagreeing with that one. Okay, fine. So how about this? Y'all ever have a club sandwich? That's three pieces, right? A club sandwich is basically a big old sandwich that's like a double-decker, where there's this third slice of bread in the middle, right? I like it. Sorry, it's like y'all are very picky as to what does and doesn't count as a sandwich, right? Right? Where the bread is stacked in this particular case, right? Okay, so it's got to be, now Kervin says a minimum of two pieces. Well, here's a question I have for you, Kervin. If it's a minimum of two, what's the maximum? Because what do you think about now, in this particular case, what about a loaf of bread, if it's just at least two? A loaf of bread, right, is just a bunch of bread stacked on top of each other. And if you could say, like, well, there's nothing in between them, well, there's some edible stuff in between them. There's bread in between all those stacks of bread, right? So maybe it's just a bunch of bread sandwiches inside a loaf. Rashad says, have you ever had a bread sandwich? Right? And Zaria says, here's our final one. I'm gonna call on Zaria here now, or I'm gonna just reference her what she wrote here. What about sandwiches that aren't bread? Can anyone think of a sandwich where there's no bread at all in them? I can think of some. What are some? So a lettuce sandwich, right? Like you've heard of maybe like a lettuce wrap, right? How about an ice cream sandwich? Y'all ever have one of those? An ice cream sandwich, I got to get rid of that. There we go. Doesn't have anything. It's got cookies, right? It's not bread at all. A Klondike bar, right? But it's not a sandwich. It's got sandwich in the title. Y'all are being ridiculous with how stingy you are on sandwiches. There's the word sandwich in the title of what the thing is. So Nick is saying a sandwich is whatever you want it to be. So is my wedding ring a sandwich? Is this mouse a sandwich, this computer mouse? Right? By the way, let me get one more wacky thing out there for you. I'm going to go into the annals of fast food right now. Have any of y'all seen the KFC Double Down sandwich? quote unquote bread in a KFC double down sandwich, the bread is two big old pieces of chicken, right? That's not bread. And then in between it is some bacon and some cheese. It's a double down. So Joseph's saying a sandwich is anything between two things. All right. So I'm just looking around me right now. So I've got a book, a pen, and a water bottle. And I put the pen in between the book and the water bottle. Have I made a sandwich right now? Rashad, are we sandwiched into our clothes? Really good question, right? Right. So essentially we're dealing with a bunch of y'all who are very liberal with how broadly you want to accept things into your category of sandwich, and a bunch of people who are real conservative and stingy and who want to be real restrictive on what does and doesn't count as a sandwich. And that's essentially what we do when we do philosophy as conceptual analysis. Everything we've been doing throughout these past, 10 minutes is coming up with what we would think of as criticisms of this definition, or another word for this is we're coming up with counterexamples. We're coming up with a bunch of examples that show us the problem with this proposed definition. These are all examples, right? Specific things like peas and soup and open-faced sandwiches and ice cream sandwiches that run counter to our proposed definition, that suggest that there's something off about our definition of sandwich. We're not accurately labeling all the conditions of sandwichhood. So this is why conceptual analysis is tricky and why it might be hard to come up with a definition, full stop, of knowledge, a complete list of necessary and sufficient terms. And this is also why I'm asking you to do your participation activity for this unit. It's all on conceptual analysis. You're coming up with counterexamples to all of these bad definitions on this worksheet. So let's go ahead and practice this a little bit now by taking a look at this first example right here of a bad definition. X is a cartoon character if and only if X is on an animated TV show. So right here, cartoon character, that's the word or the concept we're going to try to analyze. And our proposed definition is right here. X is on an animated TV show. So here I want you to work through this. It's going to be a little bit counterintuitive because I'm going to ask you to work in an order you might not be that comfortable with. First, I want you to work in the middle and come up with an example of a specific, actual, real counterexample that really exists. So you can tell this is a bad definition of cartoon character because there are cartoon characters that aren't on TV shows specifically. Like Elsa from Frozen is in a movie, the movie Frozen or Frozen 2. She's not from a TV show. So that's a specific, actual, real counterexample, Elsa from Frozen. Once you're done this middle column, then what I'd like you to do is go over to the left here and take a look at this list of two general possible types of counterexamples. These aren't necessarily actually real counterexamples. You're just listing the possible counterexamples of the most general type that these counterexamples could fit into. And what you're looking for when you do this is either a cartoon character that's not on an animated TV show. Notice they're saying it's not, right? That would be a counterexample to this definition. Or we could flip it. Someone who's on an animated TV show who isn't a cartoon. So in this case, again, is not. That's our not bit in the middle. That's what your general counterexamples will always look like. Something that fits the concept but doesn't fit the definition, or flip it, something that fits the definition but that doesn't fit the concept, right? Something that's highlighted as the word that isn't underlined, that's part of the definition, or something that's part of the definition that's underlined that isn't highlighted as part of the concept. So in this particular case, it looks like Elsa from Frozen is an example of the first type, a cartoon character that's not on an animated TV show. I don't know that we can come up with examples of the second type, someone who's on an animated TV show who isn't a cartoon character, but we did come up with a counterexample of the first type. And what that shows is that our definition is too specific. Now we can go to the far right side here, and we can finally talk about what's going on with the diagnosed problem of our definition. Our definition doesn't let in cartoon characters that are legit cartoon characters. Our definition is too restrictive, too specific to focus just on animated TV shows. So that's what I want you to do with all of these. And Jam mentioned that he's lost. Don't worry, these words necessary and sufficient are super confusing, so I'm not expecting you to be perfect at this right now. Let's just go ahead and try practicing one or two of these now as a collective. So we'll do that now for this one about humans and warm-bloodedness. So we're going to work on the class-wide practice one right now. X is a human if and only if X is warm-blooded. So I think that's a bad definition. First and foremost, tell me a specific counterexample to this. Tell me an example of something that shows this definition is bad. Oops, I didn't mean to cross this out. I meant to underline this. X is a human if and only if X is warm-blooded. What's an actual real counterexample to this? All right, so Jam says all mammals are warm-blooded. Excellent. So in general, what you're going to be saying, this isn't your specific counterexample yet, but I can write this down here, is that there are other creatures are warm-blooded, not just humans. So give me a specific example of a warm-blooded creature that's not a human. Jam's got a great example here, cats. Elmer's got another good example, dogs, right? Awesome. Either one of those would work, or any warm-blooded animal you can think of. Tigers, lions, lemurs, elephants, giraffes, horses, zebras, etc. You could go with all of those, right? These are all warm-blooded creatures that aren't humans. That's a good example for why this is a bad definition. Now let's work on filling this left part out. This is the part that gets really confusing. What you have to do now is think about the two possibilities. These might not actually match reality, but here are our two possibilities. We've got a human that is not warm-blooded. That's one possible type of counterexample. Or a warm-blooded creature that is not a human. Those are our two possibilities, right? Now, notice in this particular case, and let's do this for now, we're doing the same thing we did up above. We're saying, as our general possible counterexamples, something that fits the concept that is not part of that definition, or something that fits that definition that is not part of that concept. And again, we've got our nots in both, right? That's what a counterexample always looks like. Our two is always in the one direction not, and then flipped in the other direction not. A concept that's not part of the definition, or something that's part of the definition that's not, that wouldn't fit the concept. All right, now going back to this, what type of counterexample have we come up with over here? Have we come up with a counterexample of the first type? Or have we come up with a counterexample of the second type? What do you think? Have we described a specific counterexample of a human that's not warm-blooded? Or have we described a warm-blooded creature that's not a human? All right, Elmer's going with the second, and I completely agree in this particular case. To go even further, not only would I say that, yeah, we can come up with these sorts of counterexamples, number two, these are actually real. You can come up with these. I don't think you can come up with examples of number 1, because all humans are in fact warm-blooded. There are no actual ones that fit the first type, a human that's not warm-blooded. So you can't actually come up with ones like this. But notice it's nice to write this out so that you see which type of counterexample you're dealing with. Because if you're dealing with a counterexample of the first type, then you would circle unnecessarily specific in the far right here as the problem. But if you are dealing with a counterexample of the second type, then you would circle insufficiently broad over here. And since our counterexamples that we came up with as actually real over here of cats and dogs fits in the second type, that means we should be able to circle insufficiently broad as the problem for this one. By the way, sometimes you can come up with both types of counterexamples. That's when you would write the problem goes in both directions. But in this particular case, this problem is not about necessity. Warm-bloodedness is necessary for humanity, but it's just insufficient. It lets in too much stuff. It's too broad a definition that's going to let in more things as human than actually are human. Hopefully this is starting to help a little bit in this particular case. Why don't we all try argument number 1 now on here, not argument, definition number 1 here, about a bird as a definition, with the definition of a flying animal. So let's see. I'm going to keep our visual of what's above here, the classified practice, just so we can see what they generally look like. So X is a bird if and only if X is a flying animal. So I bet y'all can think of examples that show that's a bad definition. What are some specific counterexamples to this definition of a bird? Happy Feet. I'm assuming you're talking about the animated movie Happy Feet that's about, as Kat wrote, penguins, right? Excellent. A penguin is totally a counterexample to this. Penguins, that's a bird, but a bird that doesn't fly. I just got to shorten it to B, no fly, for bird that doesn't fly. And now bats is another type of counterexample, because that is an animal that flies. I'll call it a flyer, but not a bird. Because bats aren't birds, right? They're mammals or whatever. Chickens, some chickens are flightless chickens. They're called capons. Some chickens are so large that they're incapable of flying. Some chickens can fly, by the way. Flamingos, I think a lot of flamingos can fly. I also don't know about penguins. Penguins have those super huge peacock feathers. Some turkeys might not be able to fly. Awesome. I think ostriches might be another one. Maybe, I forget all my other flightless birds. But I think in this particular case, we've got some really good counterexamples. Emus might be one. Yeah, I'm not sure. This is where my knowledge of birds start to fly away. Sorry for the really crappy pun. All right, so our general types of counterexamples here, if we fill this out over to the left, are as follows. We can either come up with a counterexample of a bird that is not a flying animal, or we can come up with a counterexample of a flying animal that is not a bird. And again, you see how this works? I'm just taking our definition and breaking it down into its 2 parts, and then adding a not in the middle. That's what this counterexample would look like. And then flipping it for the other type of counterexample, and still adding not. That's how this always works. An X that's not a definition, or something that fits the definition that's not an X. And look, I think in this particular case, we came up with counterexamples of both types. This penguin is an example of a bird that's not a flying animal, right? Penguins are birds, they just can't fly. And then also, a bat is a counterexample of the second type. The bat is a flying animal that's not a bird. So over here under the problem, should we circle unnecessarily specific? Should we circle insufficiently broad? Or should we circle both? There, we found counterexamples of both types. What do you think we should circle on the right here? Elmer's going with unnecessarily specific. What about the rest of y'all? Y'all are right to feel a little bit confused here if you're like, wait, what? This is the hardest thing where we're trying to say, what is the problem specifically with the definition? If I can be even clearer on the right side of here, the problem with the definition. Maybe I can make this smaller so you can actually see it. Yeah. The problem with the definition is what? It's too specific, it's too broad, or actually it's a problem in both directions. So Jam and Cat are going with both, and I agree, right? Both of these over here are actual problems. Going back to this. So there are actual examples of birds that can't fly. Penguins. We just discussed them over to the right. And there also are examples of flying animals that are not birds. Where did it go? Right here. The examples of flying animals that aren't birds are bats, right? Or flying squirrels or stuff like that. So that means it's a both problem. That's why I think it's helpful to do the weird thing on the left that I'm asking you to fill out. Fill out the two general possible types of counterexamples, because they may or may not both be actual. If they're both actual, it's a both problem. But if only the top one's actual, then your problem is that the definition's too specific. It's unnecessarily specific. Or if it's a bottom problem, if it's only of the second type, then it's insufficiently broad. So it can be helpful for you to do that, but you don't have to on your worksheet, Jam. Jam asked, do you want us to point out if it's actual or not? I think it can be helpful. The reason why I'm doing that in both of these is to help me diagnose what I then circle over here as the problem, right? Because I realize there's no counterexample of the first type, but there is a counterexample of the second type in this human definition. That's why I was able to circle it's the second type of problem. It's insufficiently broad. All right, so this is what I'm asking you to do. Remember, do not freak out about a participation activity in terms of whether you get it perfect or you don't get it perfect. I just want you to try on every one of these. Look at this definition of burrito. Look at this definition of shoe. Look at this definition of a cane student, or a bachelor, or a smartphone, or your intro to philosophy teacher. Look at all these 9 different definitions and try to diagnose the problem with each of them by filling out each of the 3 things for each of these bad definitions. And that's your participation activity for this week. That, as always, is due on Monday. If I could try to wrap up class in the next minute, what I want to say is how this now relates to all of our knowledge talk. Well, Plato's Theaetetus, as we were talking about before, puts forward the following proposed definition of knowledge. Knowledge is true belief. And Plato disagrees and says, yes, it's true that truth and belief are both necessary conditions for knowledge, but those are not sufficient. Your definition is insufficiently broad, and you're going to let in more stuff for knowledge than actually is if you stick with this definition. We need another condition to limit the scope more in order to get a good definition of knowledge. And we'll be talking about that other condition in class on Tuesday because we're running out of time. That'll be our next live session. We'll start with a further discussion of what's going on here. But now that we're officially out of time for class, I will remind you your 2 assignments that you got to do for class this week. Participation activity we were just doing, the reflection that connects what we're talking about with external world skepticism to what we were talking about a little bit today with the definition of knowledge. And then you don't have to do this discussion board this week. That's now been changed to be an optional extra credit assignment. So don't do that if you don't mind it. If you want to do it, it'll count as extra credit. All right, we are done for today. Thanks for hanging out. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy your weekend. And good to know that you still think a hot dog ain't a sandwich. Have a good weekend.